Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. It feels a little bit like being back at home, and it's really neat to these kind of two worlds come together between my community back in Winnipeg and my community here in Berlin. So yeah, as she mentioned, today I want to talk about how to grow into any role specifically that you want. There we go. As was mentioned, my name is Jen Goertzen. I'm a UX designer. Sometimes I'm called product designer. It depends on how titles work wherever I happen to be. And you can find me on all the socials as Jen Goertzen. So as was mentioned, I currently live in Berlin. I moved from Winnipeg. For those of you back in Winnipeg, I'm originally from Steinbach, so I've made quite the jump, but I really just traded one bear for another. And back in Winnipeg, I co-founded a design strategy consultancy called Caribou. These days, our work is more about creating resources for teams and running workshops, because my full-time day job is with BRYTER, which is a platform for no-code automation. And just to tell you a little bit more about BRYTER, BRYTER is a tool that allows people to take processes that they were already doing, specifically lawyers, and create tools so that they can scale those processes that they were doing. Instead of having to respond to each person themselves, they can take what exists inside their head, build something, and then share a link so other people can get access to that knowledge. I actually joined BRYTER in November 2020, so the idea of joining a new team was very fresh in mind when I was thinking about what I should present to you at New Media Manitoba. The thing with joining BRYTER is it represented a lot of what I've seen in my career, which is that there was a little bit of something old, things I had seen before, and something new. The something old was the size of the team was something I was very familiar with from other companies. As well, it was a tool that existed within the browser. So I was designing a web interface. And the structure of the team. The structure of the teams where a designer exists on a cross-disciplinary team of developers, a QA, a product manager. That was something I had done before. But something new was the no-code space. I had never worked on a product where people actually created things. It was every other product, well, I guess you could say in Wire when people messages, but otherwise, people are creating very complex things. The other thing that was new was lawyers. So working with lawyers as users and understanding how they work and how they think, but also the type of content that they're creating is very new to me. And finally, something that's new is working with a remote company. I had worked remotely before, but BRYTER is remote, and they've been remote since the start. And so it was very different to move into a company that really embraces this space. So this mix of something old and something new is something that I've run into across my career, which is I always make the joke that I've never worked in the same industry twice. So I started off with a company that's in Winnipeg called Tipping Canoe, and I worked there on e-commerce. It was an online community for people who found deals, could go on here and share them with others, and so that others could access these deals. So it was kind of a forum, but specifically around deals. And then from there, I took a very large leap over to Invest Group, where I worked with financial advisors to create resources that they could show to their clients to help talk about different financial products and different concepts and help make those real for people. And then from there, I shifted over to IQ Metrics, which was designing an interactive retail experience that existed inside of brick and mortar stores. And so there there was only one form factor. Though the form factor changed size, the app could exist on an iPad or a large touchscreen. And then from there is when I moved over to Germany, and I started with Wire, which was, or is today, a secure communication and collaboration platform. So think about like a messaging app that you would use with your team to create group conversations, group calls, as well as any other conversation that you're having as part of your work. And then from there, I made another giant leap into music streaming, and specifically music streaming for classical music, which is, it was a completely different space. I really loved it. This was a product that I felt, no offense to any of the others, but this was a product that I finally felt really fit me as a person, and I was very passionate about it. And then most recently, back in November, I switched over to BRYTER, which is no-code automation. So I think the one thing in common of all of these is that they don't have very much in common. Maybe the platforms and the teams were the same, but the products were very different. And this is something that I love. I love that you work in so many different spaces as a UX designer. It works really well for me when I'm restless and I want to try something new, or I want to jump into a new topic. And I like that I have that freedom to move from space to space. But the thing is that you are a different UX designer in each space. And that's because your work as a UX designer is really affected by what exists around it. And these are things like users. If you're in a B2C, if your users are consumers, then you can find them on Facebook or you can contact them directly through the app. But if it's a B2B, then your users often, to get access to them, you have to go through account executives or you have to go through customer success managers. And there's always a bit more of a gap. The distance between you and users is different depending on where you are. And then you have the product itself. Are you working on a mobile version of something or a web version or both? And you're going to work very differently depending on which patterns you need to account for. What kind of interactions? I mean, designing for how people do video calls is different from designing for how people choose what classical music to listen to. And then you move into the team and the way you collaborate with your team. UX is a very collaborative role. We work very closely with product managers and developers. So if you are design as a service, you're going to work very differently from if you are a designer on a project team. And so you have to adapt that too. And then finally, that goes into resources, which is what do you have available to you to do your work? This could be teams that specialize in certain things, like a business insights team, or even when I was at Idagio, then we had musicologists, or when I was at Wire, then we had security experts and different subject matter experts. Or at BRYTER, we have a lot of ex-lawyers. Even our founders are ex-lawyers, and so having access to these different people. Another resource that we don't often talk about is how much time do you have to do your work. Some companies are slower paced and some are faster, and you're going to work very differently in each of these spaces. So that means even if you're doing really great at one job, when you move into another, there's always going to be a transition period where you're getting of things again. So you might even just absolutely rocking it at one company. But when you move into a new one where the team is new and the product is new, then you're going to have this transition space where you need to get the feel for things again and understand the lay of the land. This can happen naturally, but it can also be a bumpy journey because you and the team are figuring each other out. You're understanding how do you work together. And it can happen naturally, but it will also take a longer period of time because that leaves a lot of things unspoken and you have to sort of read between the lines and try to understand each other. But it doesn't have to be that way. So really the thesis, the core idea comes down to that I've learned over joining different teams is to thrive in a new organization, you need to approach it like a student. I used to describe this as, I studied graphic design at Red River College. And so I used to describe the program at Red River College as, in year one, you learn the rules. You learn about visual design principles, and you do very abstract projects to make sure you understand hierarchy and creating contrast and balance. And then in year two, you get much more practical projects that might more represent what you're going to be doing when you go out into the real world. So this is when you apply the rules. This is when you get a project where you're creating a poster or a brand campaign, and you need to apply these things like contrast and gestalt and the hierarchy and typography that you talked about. And then finally in year three, which is optional, you break the rules, which is these rules have become second nature, and these are the tools that you're working with. But now you don't really think about them. You just look at the project and you already know how you're going to tackle it. And sure, you have some learning to do, but the rules are so ingrained that you can just do the work. And so this is how I used to think about joining a new company. And then, of course, I discovered that there's actually a model for this, something much more professional, which is it's the conscious competence learning model. And I would say year one for graphic design exists around the yellow there, the conscious incompetence, which is that you're aware that you don't know things. And so you're learning, you're you know what gaps exist, and so you're actively trying to fill them. And you move up as you develop the right analysis to conscious competence, where you know what you're doing and you know what you have to work with, but you have to practice it. You have to work with these different things. And then as you get that practice and you use these tools and you see how it works, then you gain the right intuition and you move into unconscious competence, which is when you can just do the work. You don't even think about it anymore. So one thing that I really want to stress over the whole presentation is that you are an expert. Like, you are an expert in your role, whether you're a junior UX designer, you're an expert junior UX designer. If you're intermediate, you're an expert intermediate designer. It goes for the full spectrum. But when you join a new company, you're a student in that space. So you are the UX designer and you have all that experience, but when you come here, you are new, and that can be a hard idea to grasp. So to fully thrive there, you need to understand the space so that you can develop that intuition, which means you need to be a student and you need to own it, which scared me. And to be honest, I've messed this up before. There's one role in my past that I always point to as the example where I joined badly. And I always, from that point on, I've really consciously made an effort to be more intentional about how I join companies. And really, you'll see in the rest of the presentation is the different things that I've started to bring in, because it's hard to be a student in a new company, because all of your job interviews are about how competent you are. How can you now come in and act like a student? Everyone knows you're an expert and they want to see you do the work. How can you act like a student? The thing is, you are an expert and you've done this before, but you haven't done it in this space. And that, while hard to take in, can also be reassuring. Like, you are an expert, but no one expects you to be an expert here. So when you take on a student mindset openly and intentionally, it makes you a better designer, and it also builds trust with your team. So going back to this model, this is something that, again, I reuse the structure of, but I see the steps as you observe, and then you practice, and then you evolve. But it's all nice to see this model, but I know another way to communicate model when you're joining a new team is like your first 90 days, or other models about just seeing that timeline of what can you expect in your first week, in your first month. And so I put it over a timeline, which is over your first weeks, you can expect to observe. And then your first months, you practice. And then in the quarters after that, you evolve the space. So we're going to go into each of these sections in a little bit more in detail, and then feel free to ask questions at the end. So why do we observe? We observe because you're going to do your job differently in every space. And so you need to observe to fully understand what space this is. So for example, when I was with IQ Metrics, there were around 400 people spread across multiple offices, and it was B2B, versus when I went to Idagio and there's 60 people within one office. The most separated we were is we were on 2 floors, but it was B2C, so it was interacting with consumers. As well as IQ Metrics, it was one format for the product. So I designed everything once. And Idagio, I designed it for iOS, for the iPhone and the iPad, and for Android, just for the phone and for the web. And even within the web, it was different from the browser to when it was in the wrapper in the desktop app. And so you really need to understand this space. And the one thing is, as I've said, you're an expert, but that experience informs our future decisions. It doesn't make them. So it gives us a boost up, but it doesn't get us all the way there. To make good decisions for users, the product and your team in the space, you need to fully understand what you're working with. So this is where some people might ask, like, what about the onboarding? And the thing is, I would say half the companies I've joined don't have onboarding. The other half do, but the onboarding generally is very high level. It's much more administrative information. It's the same information that they give every other person. And so what a developer needs is different from a UX designer, which is different from someone on the HR team or a customer success manager. And so it's helpful information, but it's not actually doing the job. And it's not necessarily the information that you need to be successful. So where onboarding is like a lecture, observing in this state is more about self-directed learning. It's having those conversations, reading the resources that are given to you, and then following the paths. So you learn about how you talk to customers, and they mention that we have a database of customer feedback. Fantastic. Now you go over to that database and you discover that everything is tagged with customer success managers. Great, have an introduction with those customer success managers, and you just keep following the paths and building your understanding of where you are. In your first weeks, it's essentially like doing discovery on a UX project. You're doing discovery on your company. And you're going, if you're familiar with the double diamond diagram, is you're going wide right now. You're collecting a lot of information because you don't necessarily know what is going to be the most important to you. And you'll figure that out over time. Over a while, you'll be able to focus. But at the start, going very wide, you're just taking everything in. Another concept I think that relates to this is one of Chesterton's fence, which suggests that someone comes in, someone who wants to change things, and they see something like a fence, but they don't know why it's there. But before they can remove it, they must find out why it's there. Otherwise, they're more likely to do harm than good. So that's what you're doing right now. You're asking about the fences. Every fence you see, ask why it's there. You're asking about the gardens and the roads too, and just trying to figure out what's here. I guess one way that I've put it is, who would you rather work with? Someone who goes, why don't you do X? Or someone who says, why do you do Y? Or how do you do Z? And just someone very open and curious. The other thing is, asking questions shows respect for what others have built, and it shows a desire to be a part of the team, which means that asking questions builds trust. It builds trust that you want to be here for the long run, that you're here not to be a hero, to come in and change everything and be amazing. You're here to be a part of the team. So in this observing phase, I really want you to think about being confident that you have that experience, that you're an incredible junior designer and you're going to be an intermediate designer like within the next quarter, or that you're an incredible senior designer with 20 years experience, but you're also curious. You want to know, what does that mean here? And this means, for example, I'm confident that I like to collaborate with developers during ideation. I've had great experiences with that, and I find it's a good way for me to work. But I'm curious here, how do developers like to be involved in the design process? And for example, at BRYTER, in my first conversations with the team that I'm on, I asked every developer that I was working directly with, how do you like to be involved in the process? So that now I can make sure to adapt to people's needs. So an example I have is from Idagio. So I've designed many different types of usability tests over my career. So on the left-hand side, you have, can people buy a smartphone that they're confident enough that they want to buy, that they have the right information? Versus Idagio, can people find a recording of a specific sonata that they heard at the concert on Sunday? The fact that that's even a question is not something that I ever thought of. And that's something I had to learn when I joined the company. So when I joined the company, I have to say, like, I love classical music. I listen to so much classical music. When I joined Idagio, I found out I know nothing about classical music. And so it was a very humbling experience, but it was good in that way that I got to essentially start fresh and learn about a whole new audience and how they think. And the product as well. While I was familiar designing mobile apps and desktop apps, I wasn't familiar with music streaming, or how does music go from getting it from the labels to being able to show it to people, and how to show direct information. So on Idagio, you can open up, you can search for any specific piece of music and they will show you every recording they have of that specific music. How do you map something like that when the music comes from so many different labels? And the team, about the team structure and the team size was something I was a little bit familiar with, but I didn't yet know how they worked here. They worked differently than my previous roles. And then resources wise, it was also very similar to other companies I had been at, but there's always there's always learning. So I spent my first weeks at Idagio speaking with people from musicologists to developers, and I read everything that we had on our users, and I asked a lot of questions about the vision of the product so I could understand what challenges do we have right now, what does success look like for us. And by doing this, it allowed me to quickly design a usability test that would give us information that would be useful to the team that we could directly apply to what we were doing. But I could only understand that because I knew who our users were so I could recruit them. And I knew how our product worked or what our goals were right now, so I could design activities that would tell us whether or not that was successful. So observing in this first phase builds your understanding. It starts to build your team's trust. It starts to build that foundation. Then we move into practicing. So when you practice in this space, that usually happens within your first months and your first projects. As you're building your understanding, there's really an overlap. You've smoothed from one into the other where you have to start applying what you're doing right away. So why do we practice? We practice because this is the first time your experience and what you've learned has come together. This is my only sports analogy in the whole thing, which is that if you can run and you can throw a frisbee and you've read the rule book and you've watched a team play a game of ultimate frisbee, do you think your first game with them is going to be great? It's probably going to be a little bit awkward, where you're trying to figure out how you fit these skills in with learning the rules, and the rules are going to be playing in your head, like you can't consciously apply them. And it's the same when you join a new company. So I've run usability tests on iOS apps before, and I've learned about how to choose music to listen to. But now designing a usability test is a new way to flex that muscle, is a new way to think. And often I describe it as like you're thinking through mud. It feels so much more difficult than usual. So when you're practicing, you're going to find that you're bringing up these levels. So your understanding of the users has grown, your understanding of the product has grown, same with the team and the resources, but there's still gaps there. Now, what practicing does is it checks if those things that you filled in, you understood them correctly. And it also helps you identify what don't you know yet. So by designing the test, you realize, I don't actually know how our settings work. I don't actually know what happens when someone signs up for the first time. Practicing also gives people a chance to check your work because this is your first work. And the thing is, there aren't really real practice projects in the workplace. Everything will ship, especially if you're a startup. If you're doing something, they're going to put you to work right away. And what you build, even if it's not going to be your best work, is customers are going to see it. So what is practice? What separates practice from play is the size of the feedback loop. So when you're practicing, you do frequent check-ins versus when you play, you do an entire thing and then you reflect on that. So we do this a lot in sports or when you're learning an instrument. So in sports, if you're having a practice, then this isn't an analogy, it's an example, then you'll do drills or you'll run a play or you'll do just a specific chunk of something with there's purpose to that chunk of something. And it's very one-sided. There's one step to it usually. And it's the same in music. You'll practice scales or you might practice the whole song, but only to practice your dynamics or to practice your tempo. Versus play, you're going to do the whole song exactly as you would play it, and you reflect on all of those things. Or when you play a game of soccer or football or ultimate frisbee, you'll play the whole game and then you'll reflect on it. And you do the same when you start at a new role. You do a small bit of work and then you stand back and you evaluate. So that means you work incrementally. So you do, for example, just gathering the requirements, and then you share it with someone and you go, this is how I see the requirements. Does that sound right? And then you recruit for your research and you say, this is my plan for recruiting. And you don't even you're not saying, is that right? You're just saying, this is what it is. And it gives space for people to say, oh, we do that differently here. Or there's this resource over here that could help you with that. So it surfaces what you're doing so people can step in and help you join the team. Versus if you do a grand reveal where you do all of the work and then you come in and you say, this is what I've done, chances are you've missed something. Like, it could still be good, but it would have been great. The thing is, practicing openly is hard because it's easy to think that by sharing our work while it's in progress, it looks like we're unsure about what we're doing. But I've learned over time, and that's how I felt. And I've learned by asking others, how did it look? That's not how other people see it. People say it as it shows an openness to learn how to work with this team in this space. It shows that you want to be a part of this team, that you're excited to be here. So you share your work and you say, this is what I'm doing. Other people get to be a part of that. Even if they're not adding to it or asking questions or changing it, they feel like they're a part of the journey. It also allows teams to get to know you and how you work. So you might be the first UX designer here, or you're the first UX designer with a specialty in research or animation, and people don't know what that looks like. And so it educates them, and it gets people even more excited about what you could do here. Working incrementally also gives space for feedback in both directions. It means that you're taking everything you do and you say, this is how I see it. Is this how you see it? And it means that you can say, this is something that I'm doing, and people go, you know what, that's actually better than what we do here. How about we adopt that too? Or they say, there's this other person that help you with this, or there's this other resource. It just gives space for a conversation to happen that wouldn't otherwise. So while you're practicing, I want you to think about being open. You're saying, here's what I'm doing, which can be very difficult because it feels like talking too much. It feels like you're sharing too much. And oh my God, people must be so sick of listening to me by now. But actually, usually if people are, if you feel like you're oversharing, people are probably only just starting to hear you. So just keep sharing, share everything. I feel like I'm the most active person on my company Slack. And then once you're saying, here's what I'm doing, you're being flexible. You're saying, how can I adapt this to support your work? So you're not just sharing and saying, I am right, look how right I am. You're sharing and you're saying, this is what I've done. And then it gives space for other people to come in and help you find your place within the team. So for example, you might say that I want to recruit people for research using Facebook. And by being flexible, it allows people to say, oh, we've tried Facebook before, it didn't really work for us. Or it allows people to ask, oh, why did you choose Facebook instead of Twitter? And by openly sharing, this is what I plan to do, people can say, oh, we already have a screener survey, you could use that. And it saves you work and effort, and it makes people feel like they were a part of this as well. An example of this practicing was when I would join Wire. By the practicing point, or I guess when I joined the company, then my understanding of the users was somewhat there, and part of that was just personal experience working with very similar products in the past. My understanding of the product was not there. This was my first messaging app. And I think products like Wire or Slack or Skype seem really simple on the surface. Like you just write messages and you send them, and you can call people sometimes. But they're actually much more complex than that. Notification settings, and when people send messages, where do they go and how do they format? How do you make sure people know how to format their messages properly? And it's just, there's so many things. The team, I was somewhat familiar with that kind of structure of team. And the resources, again, I had been with startup-like companies before, so I was familiar with that. So in my first project, I paired with another designer. And then in the following projects, I continued to share my work with other team members that I was getting to know. So I got to know a few developers on each of the platform teams, and it allowed me, when I wasn't sure about a thing, or really just in general sharing my work, there were sometimes I would share openly with the whole team, and sometimes I would share openly with very specific people. So there was one QA at Wire that I would say changed the way I write design specs forever, because I would always show my design specs and he would poke holes in them and show me how I can make them better. And it's the same with the entire team, made me a better designer because I was sharing with them and I got that feedback. Working openly, it helped us course correct when needed. So it turned out when I had first started observing, I didn't learn a lot about calling or how calling works. And it turns out calling is complicated, especially when you have group calls. And it also let us find out when someone else needed to be looped in. So this was the first time I got to meet the audio team and better understand how they work, especially when it comes to secure messaging. How do you have secure audio calls? And so I learned a lot there. So over this, we got to know how I work and how they work. And we started to develop It means that the team changes how they work too, because now they're learning how to work with you. So you're both adapting to each other. Practicing openly develops trust with your team because they're a part of the work that you're doing. It feels like you're becoming part of the team. You're not just an outsider looking in. Now you're actually practicing with them. And finally, we're going to talk about evolve the space. So evolving is all about growth. It's really about growth for both you and your team. And growth looks different over your time with a company. Practicing, when you're practicing, you're applying skills that you already have in a new setting. And when you're growing or evolving is developing those skills and gaining new ones in a setting that you've come to know. And I really am a strong advocate for this happening after you've had time to practice on a team, because I think it's developing that right intuition. Before that, you might not know what space you're working in, so you might do something that's a brand new skill for you, but you don't necessarily know how to apply it properly, and this is a very new space for you. And so I really believe developing these new skills should happen after you feel like you understand the space. And so developing your skills and evolving happens when we look beyond our day-to-day work, and we actually get a chance to extend our skills, when we push the boundaries of what our skills are, when we push the boundaries of what is our work, not just the projects that you assign, but looking for projects yourself, creating projects. And by doing this, you can extend what the team can do. So to evolve your space, you need to identify opportunities, and you need to know how to go after them. By this point, you have a rich understanding of the users, the product, the team, and the resources. You feel comfortable, you've developed that intuition, and the ball is rolling. You're working really naturally with the team now. And when you have this rich understanding of space, you can see when something is missing. So when you join the team, you were just taking in so much information that you wouldn't necessarily notice when, oh, the company doesn't know this, or we don't actually know how this feature is used, because you're taking in so much. But once you have that, you can start to identify those gaps. So you're looking for gaps in understanding. What don't we know about our users? Tension in processes. Where are you constantly running into walls with your team? Or where do you never have enough time to do something? And you're also looking for gaps and questions in the product. What features don't you know very much about? Or are people always complaining about, or people really love, but you're not quite sure why they love them? So you're looking for those question marks. And you're looking for what, if answered, would open new doors for your team. And this is, I think, the key point in evolving, and I'm going to reiterate this over, is that you're being very intentional. You're looking for opportunities that help the whole, that are not just for you, because you're not a hero. You're here for the team. And so what's going to help the team and the company? And so you're here to be very intentional. You're solving the most important problem. What is a problem that, if solved, would give everyone an hour back every week? What is a problem, if solved, would help the whole company make better decisions about which features to build? And then you're being bold. And bold happens in varying degrees. Bold can just be simply stepping outside of your work and doing a small initiative. Bold can also be doing something that the company's never done before. Either one stretches what the team can do. So an example is the way we work doesn't fit the new type of work that we're doing. So when I was at Dajo, in the summer, we repositioned, or I guess in the spring, then we repositioned from not only music streaming to offering online concerts. And the thing is, it's different to work on a product that's mature and already exists, and you're just doing small feature work, to working on a product that's brand new and you're building something up from the ground, and you have to build a lot very quickly, and you're building entire features. It's a different way of working. And so we discovered our process just really didn't work. Things had the scope way too large on a lot of things, because we were used to going into very nitty-gritty details of features. And the amount of time that we had for things didn't line up with the size of every project. So the bold move was to work with my team to create a new process that was unique to our team and our work. It was very much looking at how are we working, what are we doing, and how can we make this work for the entire team, so both for developers and designers. So I'm going to show you 3 examples in this section from different companies for different time spans, because I want to show that evolving your space can be quite small, but it can also be a lot larger. And so there is a lot of there's a lot of space in there for you to grow. So at Wire, when I was at Wire for about 2 months, I had gained an understanding of how the team works. I had done a few projects with the team. I saw how they communicated, how they worked together, as well as what resources did they use, what did they pay attention to. And I had also gained a better understanding of rules behind behavior in the product. And this specific behavior was when something happens in a conversation, whether that's a new chat or someone likes your message or someone's calling you, what happens to that conversation. So when these things light up in Wire, the list actually reordered and some text appeared in the row. What we were missing was a source of truth for what did we expect, which meant that every time we came across a new feature and it affected the conversation itself, the conversation row, then we had to almost relearn all of the structure, and we had to go back and check, okay, so what happens in this case, so we needed a source of truth. That way we didn't have to relearn this every time. So I created documentation that outlined the behavior, the copy, and the defined product rules. And I was able to do that because I understood what kind of documentation will the team actually use, what information is important to the team, what do we need to make product decisions, and I understood how the logic behind these things worked. When I was at Idagio for 4 months, I had spent some time, again, doing projects, learning how the team works. I got to know who our users are and the product goals. What we were missing, though, was quick turnover of insights from tests. So when you do a usability test and you take what you've learned so that people can actually use it, we were in a project that had a very short time span. So we needed to go directly from test into developing it and into iterating on it. And we didn't have time to do what we had done before, which was very thorough and writing notes and cataloging everything and tagging everything. So because I understood what the team needed, and I also deeply understood what our goals were with the test, I was able to find a new way to visualize that so that we could go directly, as the tests were happening, the insights were up on the wall. So anyone in the company could walk by and see what was happening. And when I was at Acumetrics, I had done many initiatives, but I think the biggest one is after I was there for 1.5 years, I had developed relationships with the commercial team because it's a B2B product. And so we get our clients through account executives and through the sales team. And I also had gained customer feedback on the product. So through those relationships, I've been getting customer feedback and better understanding what kind of challenges the customers had. I also had a better understanding of our product suite and the different things that were being sold to customers. So if customers had this product, they probably had these other products as well. What we were missing at this point was the understanding of where the product was most needed in the store. Previously, we had just customers bought the product and we said, good luck. And they would go into the store and they would try to put it somewhere and so it worked. So I started a research project with a colleague to really dig into how people shop. And following this with what we learned, I developed a training program to give to store employees. So our customers previously got the product and not really anything else. They knew how to use the product, but they didn't know how to introduce it to their teams. So I created a training program because I had spent time with the store employees and I had spent time understanding how this would fit into the store. So creating a program that these customers could then give to their employees. And the thing is, I think what I wanted to really illustrate there is the longer you're with a company and the more you know, the more it's possible for you to do as a team because you've developed that rich understanding and so you move quicker, you have that intuition. So evolving intentionally, again, nurtures that trust with your team because it shows that you care about the whole. You care about the whole team and the whole product and the whole vision. You're not just their hero. So this model isn't just about how to grow into a role, but also how to build trust with your team. And the other thing I want to iterate is that this isn't linear and it doesn't have a set timeline. It really depends where you're moving from and where you're moving to. So if you move from the same industry into a similar industry and a similar product, you might only observe for 2 weeks and you might only practice for a month. And after that, you've got it. You filled in the gaps, you understand what's going on, and you hit the ground running. But if you go into a new industry and a different product, you might find that you observe for a month, and then you practice for about 4 months. And then after second quarter, third quarter, now you've got it. Now you can run with it, but it takes a little bit more time to fill in those different gaps. And the other thing is, it's not smooth, is every time you hit something that you haven't done at this company before, even if you've had experience doing it before, you don't necessarily know what does it look like here. So back in February, I got my first discovery project at BRYTER. So the first time I was really doing discovery from zero to understand what do we need to build here. And while I had done discovery for the last 10 years, I told everyone I was having multiple existential crises where I was going, do I design? Do I discover? How do I discover? Am I any good at this? But it was just figuring out, what does it mean at BRYTER? What kind of resources do I have? How do I work with the team? Where do I go for different things? Finally, I know we're running short on time, so I'm just going to zip through this last bit, which is I want to emphasize how to grow into a role that you want, because I don't think this is stressed enough in our industry, and it was definitely not stressed enough in my career, which is, like, I admittedly have changed jobs way more times than I ever thought I would. I was at Investors Group for a grand total of 4 months, and I almost didn't leave because I thought that it would make me look like a failure. And it's the same. I was with Wire for 9 months, and I almost didn't leave because I thought it would make me look like a failure. The thing is, companies and people change, and sometimes they're not what they seemed in interviews. I'm not saying that Investors Group or Wire weren't what they seemed in the interviews, but that people change, and the way the teamworks change, teams work change. And when there's a misalignment between a company and a person, it can be incredibly detrimental to your entire life. And it could be, it's not that they're burning you out, it could be just that it doesn't work for you anymore, that you're not motivated by it. And that said, not everyone needs to be incredibly passionate about their job, but I'm one of those people. I really need to be interested in the work I'm doing. So when I'm not, then it's time for me to move on. So really the key is know what you want and know what you don't want, because that's going to help you pick a job that you think is going to be good for you. It'll help you change a job when you say, I want to do less design and more research, or vice versa. And it'll help you leave a job. It'll help you understand it's time for me to go. It's time for me to find something else. Because a lot of what I've been talking about today is talking about looking at others and reflecting on what they're doing. But I really want to stress, never leave yourself out of the equation. Your needs come first. You can adapt to anything. You don't have to. Let anyone tell you that you have to. Choose to adapt and grow into teams that are going to support you. Choose the teams that are healthy for you, and make you a better person outside of work as well. So in conclusion, I love my job. I can't believe I get paid for it because I get to work in so many spaces and learn about so many things. I am a keener at heart. Only the Canadians will understand that. But that's what I love about UX. It's fulfilling, it's exciting, but it's also fulfilling because you get to work with so many different people. When you come in as a student, you build those relationships with your team so that you can have a strong future together. By observing at the start, you show respect to your team. You show respect for the work that they've done so far. By practicing openly, you show that you're here to be on their team, that you want to see how you can play together. And by evolving intentionally, you show your dedication to the team. You show that you're choosing to solve the most important problem to make everyone better. I saw this tweet a few weeks ago about trust and the difference between when we have trust and when we don't have trust. And the thing is, when you build that trust with your team, you go straight to yes. And you can do so much more when you go straight to yes. So when you build this foundation from the start, you remove all these questions and you go straight to just do it. And when you have this trust with your team, anything is possible for you and your team. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Jen. Thank you so much. That was amazing. A lot of what you said during your presentation resonates with me. And the first I'll say is that, you talked about having that alignment with the company you're working with, the culture the company has, and your own career and what you're looking to build, it's important that you feel comfortable in that role. And
Absolutely.
never to feel, I've stayed here for maybe a short period of time and I can't leave. I'll look like a failure. No, it's really important to enjoy what we do.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. Also, you talked about moving, between industries and between roles. I would say at this point that I, as a HR professional, haven't worked in a number of industries and never done anything in tech. I got my first job in tech, even though it wasn't a technical role, but it sounded really cool at the beginning. I was like, okay, it's so interesting to work in tech and all. But when I started the role itself, I realized I was going to be having conversations with people. I was going to be having discussions with people. So I felt I needed to know the industry language. Mm-hmm. And then I wasn't, like you said, you have to be a student. You might be an expert from, you might have all the experience, but you need to be a student when you're in a new space. So I started to ask questions. Like you rightly mentioned, I started to ask questions. And even up till now, I do it when I go in a meeting and I hear something for the first time. Google is my friend.
Yes,
I go on Google and then I check to see what this is all about. And so as soon as we stop learning, we stop growing. So that's really important to know. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to open the floor for questions now. So if you do have questions for Jen, please put them in the Q&A box, and Jen will be happy to answer those questions. So yeah, Jen, just while we wait for people to drop their questions, UX is all about solving problems. It's all about some product or service effectiveness. You have to research, iterate, like you said, and test. So I know this processes, all the three are very important. But would you say one is more critical than the other, or do you feel they're all, equally critical?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked that before, actually. I think research is the most critical for making sure that you're doing the right thing, and it's going to really inform how you iterate. But that said, I'm also familiar with being in a startup space and not necessarily having the resources to do that research, in which case I would really put it on the other end, on test. Make sure you test. And the funny thing is, the companies that I see really pushing for testing, like we have to test, are the ones that have been burned by not testing in the past. And I've been there. I've been burned by not testing. And so nothing sells usability testing than by not doing it. But yeah, I would say, depending on where you are, if you have the ability, it's all about research. That doesn't mean you can't test. But if you don't have the ability, test. Make sure you leave time for that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that. Let's see. I don't see any questions yet.
Oh, there seem to be a couple there.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to go on to say, looking at those companies you've worked, startups, and then the really big companies you've worked. You talked about having worked at companies that had 60 staff and having worked at companies that had up to 400 employees. And working on all those projects, music streaming to designing and all that. What project would you say is the most challenging and also the most rewarding? It might be, two projects to say one was most challenging and one was most rewarding.
Oh, that's an interesting question as well. I guess I would say, like, right now, I feel very challenged. At BRYTER, I feel very challenged because I'm new. I feel very new here. And partly because of the content, because when you talk about communication and how people are talking to one another, that's something that we can all relate to. we use text messaging apps, we use collaboration platforms regularly. Or when it comes to music streaming, we all, like I use Spotify quite a bit. I use Idagio now too, but we've all used these platforms. But when it comes to this, and I'm talking to lawyers about how they think about their work, sure, there's simplified ways to do it, but when we talk use cases and the types of things that they're building, it takes a lot more effort to really pull out what is important right now, what is important to the user. And I'm also working in a new space. We have these, they call them Intro to Business courses. Every Friday for half an hour, an ex-lawyer will tell us what is it like to be a lawyer and how it's nothing like Suits. And so I'm learning about these new hierarchies. And I guess what's challenging right now is we're changing the information architecture of the product. And that means that I have to really understand all of these pieces and how they fit together and how other people are thinking about them. And you can't just ask people, how do you think about this? What is a module? Like, what really is a module? You can't ask. And so it's trying to talk to these people who work in a very different space than I do and something I can't necessarily relate to, and trying to get inside their head. But that said, I love a challenge. And so I told my product manager the other day, this is exactly the type of work that I want to do. So I'm enjoying it.
Oh, that's great. Sorry, I was in the answered tab for some reason. I have some questions here. There is an additional role you have, which is confounding Caribou. How has that affected the way you approach work or roles?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I found that has affected the way that I work in-house. And actually it inspired some of the projects that I've created otherwise, which is that when you work as a consultant, you get to experiment things, you get to try out new things, because you're working on a project by project basis, and you're expected as a consultant to bring in new ways of working. You're not with a team who has to come up with a process and carry that process for the next 3 quarters. When you come in as a consultant, you can try new things and see how they work. And so it gave me a chance to really develop my skills and learn. And I was doing consulting on the side of working full time. So it was like I had an experimenting space and then move into a working space. So take what worked there and bring it over here. And so I also found it was great for trying out new things that I didn't think I would get to do otherwise. So you get to work with many different types of people in different teams in an even more condensed time frame.
Okay, thanks. And the next question, how do you define your role at a startup where you are asked to do many roles or wear many hats?
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't, I think the time that I really got that was at my first role when I was at Tipping Canoe, because I would actually go quite often between UX designer and a graphic designer. So creating graphics for blog posts, for example, and I would do some print work sometimes as well. But otherwise at other roles, then I haven't had to wear many hats. I guess at Adagio, then they called me the research lead for a while. So I had the research lead hat as well as the product designer one. And I think defining my role, it was really, it's an interesting thing at startups, because you don't really get to define your role because everyone is wearing many hats. So it's really defining what you're responsible for and intentionally choosing your projects. And that's something that I also learned over my career, is that you don't have to say yes to everything. Sometimes if it's a small team, someone has to say yes to it. But it's very intentionally volunteering for the projects that align with what I think my role is and align with where I want to grow as an individual. So I don't want to be doing more print work. I don't want to be doing graphic design work. So even though I could, and even though I really enjoy it, like I do a lot of art on the side, I don't want to bring that into my professional life. So when those kinds of projects come up, I'm not the first one to raise my hand. If no one raises their hand and something has to happen eventually, sure, I'll do it. But I wait. I'm picky. I've learned to be picky. And I admit part of that comes from the privilege of being a senior designer, being in the industry for 10 years. But I say, like, as soon as you can be picky, do it, because that's when you really start to focus your career.
Thanks for that answer, Jen. I'm just going to move on when changing companies, have you got the imposter syndrome? How do you prevent this from coming to you?
Oh my God, every single team. Like even when I join BRYTER, I get imposter syndrome. And even when I join a company, every time I start doing a new type of project, like the discovery project, I call it an existential crisis, but it's also imposter syndrome. It's good old imposter syndrome. And I think you can't avoid it. You're going to have it. And so it's just talking through it. And so part of it is, this is actually something that I'm writing about right now, is your comfort. So remember where your comfort zone is, because your comfort zone is where your strengths lie. Your comfort zone is why you were hired, because you're really good at these things. So that's why people hired you for them. And so fall back on your comfort zone when you first join a company, and as you learn and you figure out what you do here, then you start to build on it, and then you start to stretch outside of it. So stay in your comfort zone where you are strong, where you know exactly what you're doing, and then be a student, be curious. And I think that's the thing about imposter syndrome. We think that we have to be the best at everything and we have to be the expert, but you're not. You're the best at things in your comfort zone, and you're the best at things that you've done before. But you are a student in this space. And that's, I think, also really driven me to embrace being a student, is it helps with imposter syndrome, because I go out and I'm curious and I'm asking about everything. And at BRYTER, I got feedback, I think in my third or fourth week, from someone who said, why hasn't anyone asked this question before? And it's because I was asking, which made me feel good that asking these questions is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, imposter syndrome, it's never going to stop, but just remember where your strengths are, and everything else, learning. And if the other thing is, if people don't respect that learning, that's a sign of a larger problem, but that's a separate conversation.
Sure, I agree with you, Jane. Manue says, did you find a new job before you left old job?
So I did have the privilege, and it worked out that I managed to find a new job before I left any of my jobs. I am a very cautious person, which is probably why I haven't done freelance full time. So always I would start looking. And so what I would do is, when I recognize a misalignment was happening in my current company, I would start doing even more reflecting on what was working and what wasn't. And can I make this role something that's good for me? And then I started creating check-ins. So depending on how it's going, a check-in every other week or once a month that goes, is it better or worse? And at a certain point, one of the check-ins would trigger, okay, it's time to start looking. So you can still keep going, but you're not waiting until the very end. You're not waiting until you're completely burnt out, or you are just like everything else is falling apart. No, you remember to put yourself first. And I found those checks have really helped me look at it a little bit more objectively. So long story short, I always found a job before I got the new one. I was lucky enough to do so.
Great. The last question here, how have you managed conversations with new team members who aren't as responsive as you would like?
I'm wondering if we could get some clarification on that one. I'm not sure what we mean about not as responsive, and if they're new team members for my team, or if new team members on a team that I've joined.
Guessing what Juliet is trying to say is like new team members that's probably you joined or have joined, like
okay,
someone in the team aren't as responsive.
On the team that I've joined. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I have to go back further than BRYTER. BRYTER has a very responsive team. I guess it's going at it from different angles. It's really reading the room and reading how people want to interact with you. So one thing that I do whenever I join a team is I call them up to speed conversations. So I set up hour-long conversations with people across the company to really get to know them and understand how do they see the product and how do they see the audience. And in those conversations already, you might gauge, okay, this person is going to tell me a lot and this person isn't. And so it's really finding those smoothest paths As I mentioned before, like when you have a conversation and you find out that this resource exists or you should talk to this person, you follow those paths and you're going to find there's certain paths that are essentially close to you. Like someone doesn't really talk to you, but they're probably not the only person in that role. And so you can talk to someone else in that role and get the information you need and then keep moving forward. And it might be that just some people, they want to see what you do here for a while, or they have to warm up to you. And so it's really follow what you can, but don't force anything at the start. Is really, you're just here to observe and join their team. So you're really adapting to how they want to communicate with you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I will pass the hour. So thank you so much. We've come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for taking us through your career journey, Jen. We're glad you were able to come share with us today. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to our founders for funding partners for making this possible. And this session is recorded, so you can actually watch on our website or on our YouTube channel. And thank you everyone for joining and for staying with us, even though we're past the hour. I'll say again, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, please do so on our website and stay tuned for our next network speaker series. I want to say, Jen, I know it's late in Berlin, so I'll say have a great night. And to every other person joining us today, I'll say have a great day. So thank you all for joining.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. And Jen, have a great night.